Good afternoon, everyone. Today, of course, we're just a few days away from the incredible day of Yom Yerushalayim. Everyone, of course, is invited Monday morning to the Tayelet, not far from here, the Has Promenade for our annual Tfilah Chagigi. It begins at 7:30 in the morning. Musical Hallel on the Tayelet overlooking the Ir Atika, overlooking the Old City.
What buses go there?
The 90 and 91 and 78 all go right to the 510 also. They all go right to the Tayyat. Okay. So our topic, therefore, this afternoon is City of Dreams. Yerushalayim is the city of dreams. As we learn, if you take a look at text Aleph on our sheets, text number 1 on our sheets, we say in the Tehillim that we're very familiar with the Tehillim that we say before Birkat HaMazon on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Shir Amala b'shuv Hashem et Shivat Sion hayinu kecholmim. Okay, a song of ascent to God unto God. Then when we talked about God returning us to Sion, to Zion, hayinu kecholmim, we will be like dreamers. And indeed, if you had asked our grandparents or great-grandparents in the Shtetlach of Europe or in the Kfarim of North Africa, if you'd asked them, or if you had told them that we'd be zochet to be sitting right where we are and learning Torah in Yerushalayim or Kodesh, should we be zochet, that we'd have the merit to be able to walk the cobblestones of the ancient city of Yerushalayim, they probably would have looked at us like we're nuts. Okay, you're a dreamer, you're out of your mind. But that's our mitzvah, that's our reality. We've, in our generation, merited to see the fulfillment of the dreams of thousands of years, the return to Yerushalayim. There's a very, very well-known Gemara at the end of Masechet Makot, the last few lines of the Gemara Makos. We're going to learn together in a moment. It's a famous story of Rabbi Akiva gathered together with some of the other sages as they come to look at the destruction of the city of Yerushalayim at the hands of the Romans during the time of Churban Bayit Sheni. And Rabbi Akiva, of course, did not live in Yerushalayim. He lived in Bnei Brak. And Rabbi Akiva gathers together some of the other sages, and they come to see what's transpired in Yerushalayim. And this is where we pick up in the Gemara. He says, Shuv pamachat hayu olim Yerushalayim. Another time, when these sages got together, they came to Yerushalayim. Kevan shegiu laharat sofim karu videim. When they came to Mount Scopus, okay, the site, which if you think about this, the site of Hebrew University sits today on Mount Scopus, and there's a magnificent synagogue on the campus of Hebrew University called the Hecht Synagogue. And the Hecht Synagogue, instead of having the Aron Kodesh in the middle, like here, like where we're sitting, the Aron Kodesh is front and center in the middle of the room. The way the Aron Kodesh sits in the Hecht Synagogue is that it's split in two. There are two narrow sections of the Aron Kodesh on either side of a long panoramic window that overlooks the old city. So whenever I learn this Gemara, I think of that scene of standing on Har Tzafim and looking out, gazing at the whole old city. Okay. So when they got to Har Tzafim, they got to Mount Scopus, they ripped their clothing because they saw the destruction in front of them. They ripped their clothing in mourning. Kevan shegiu lahar habayit, but when they got to the Har Habayit, to the Temple Mount, they saw a fox running the place where the Holy of Holies stood. Okay, I won't even say once stood. It stood like probably just days before. And the place where the Holy of Holies was, now there were foxes, wild animals running there. So what happens? They begin to cry. The other sages begin to cry. The Rabbi Akiva mitzachek. And Rabbi Akiva begins to laugh. Amru lo, they say to him, V'neimata mitzachek. They said to him, Rabbi, why are you laughing? How can you possibly be laughing at such a time? And like any good rabbi, how does Rabbi Akiva answer their question? With a question of his own, right? And he says, the Gemara says, Amar Lam, he says to them, V'neimata bochim. Why are you crying? Amrulo, they say to him, Makam shekatubo, v'azar hakrev yumat, v'achshav shulim hilchavo, v'lo nivke, the place where the verse describes that if a impure person comes there there to be put to death. And now wild animals are running there, and you're not crying? So says Rabbi Akiva, okay, Amar Lahan, he says to them, L'kach ani mitzachek. That's precisely why I'm laughing. Tichtiv, as the pasuk says, he's going to bring a verse, a pasuk from the Sefer of Yeshaya Hanavi. Va'ida li edim ne'emanim et Uriah Kohen et Zachariah ben Yevrachiyahu. He says, we will see before me as reliable witnesses Uriah the priest and the Navi Zachariah. And now we're going to get a parenthetic note in our Gemara. Uriah etzel Zachariah. What possible connection could there be between the story of Uriah and the story of Zachariah? Why does the Gemara ask that question? Uriah b'mikdash Rishon was Zachariah b'mikdash Sheni. Uriah lived during the time of the first temple, and Zachariah lived during the time of the second temple. So what possible connection, the Gemara asks, could this verse be referring to between these disparate times in Jewish history? It must mean that the verse is telling us what? That the later prophecy of Zechariah is dependent upon what? The fulfillment of the earlier prophecy of Uriah. Okay, but Uriah Chtiv, and what was written regarding Uriah? Okay, because of your iniquities, Zion will be leveled like a plain. And what does Zechariah prophesy? Zechariah, of course, was a much more contemporary prophecy to Rabbi Akiva and his comrades, right? Zechariah lived during the time of Bayit Sheni. And what did Zechariah prophesy? Od yeshvus kenim eskenot b'rechavot Yerushalayim. Okay, once again, men and women will grow old in the streets of Yerushalayim. And that's the end of the parenthetic note. Now, Rabbi Akiva explains, he says, until I saw in my own eyes the fulfillment of the earlier prophecy of Uriah, who said that Zion will be leveled like a plain, and that the Temple Mount will be a shrine in the wilderness, until he saw that come to fulfillment, he was afraid what? That the more contemporary prophecy of Zechariah, who in the midst of the Roman occupation and subsequent destruction, prophesies that once again, men and women will grow old in the streets of Yerushalayim. The Jewish people will one day return to Yerushalayim. He said, I was afraid that until I saw Uriah's earlier prophecy come true, I was afraid the more contemporary prophecy of Zechariah would never come true. And now that I've seen with my own eyes the fulfillment of the earlier prophecy of Uriah, of Zion being leveled like a plain, I also can know with certainty that one day Zechariah's prophecy of men and women being allowed to grow old here, to live their lives here, to live out their lives here in Yerushalayim, will also one day come true. Okay, but with this language, they said to him, Akiva nichantanu, Akiva nichantanu. Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us. Okay. So what does Rabbi Akiva give us? Rabbi Akiva gives us perspective. Rabbi Akiva introduces us to the idea of being able to see the big picture. That in the annals of Jewish history, of the continuing drama of Jewish destiny, we have to be able to look at the various events and not see them for the here and now, but see them within the greater context, the bigger picture of Jewish history. Okay. So I want to share with you a beautiful story that was told by Matagor. Matagor was the Lieutenant Colonel Matagor, was the commanding officer of the brigades that recaptured the old city in June of 1967. It's Matagor's voice that we hear in that famous recording, Rabbi Biadenu, Rabbi Biadenu. And Matagor, in his memoirs, writes the following story. He says, there was a group of Chayalim that had just entered the old city near Shor, near the Zion Gate, at that moment that he made that announcement, Rabbi Biadenu, Rabbi Biadenu. And this group of Chayalim, who would not identify as being religious, they would call themselves secular, whatever. And again, you know me well enough that I don't like the labels, but they would call themselves secular. So this group of secular Chayalim had just entered the old city through the Zion Gate. And they hear But the Gore's voice, that announcement, Harabai B'Yadenu, Harabai B'Yadenu, the Temple Mount is in our hands, the Temple Mount is in our hands. And one of these young men turns to the rest of the group and says, we need to go to the Kotel Maravi. We need to make our way to the Kotel. Now, if you think about this, for 19 years, from May of 1948 until June of 1967, not a single Jew was allowed to enter the old city and go to the Kotel. Okay? And also, you think about this, these are Chayalim, which means they're 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, which means that none of these young men had ever been to the Kotel. Not a single one of them had ever been to the Kotel. And more than that, none of them identified as being religious. But as soon as they heard that announcement, they decide they're going to have to go to the Kotel. Now, I don't know about you guys. I spent 15 years of my life living and teaching in the old, not living but so much, but teaching and come out every day in and out of the old city. And for me, I know the old city pretty well, like the back of my hand, but there are many people who, if you go to the old city a few times a year, it's very confusing. You find the alleyways dark, and maybe they wind around and it's like a maze. And if we don't know exactly where we're going, it can be very confusing. But think about this Tekufa, this period. This is a period after 19 years of the Jordanians basically essentially making the old city, the Jewish quarter, a garbage dump. They demolished all the synagogues, all the buildings. They left it in rubbles. And then couple that with a few days of the most intense guerrilla warfare in tight quarters in those narrow alleyways and dark passages. And in the midst of all that chaos, these Chayalim come into the Zion Gate and they want to start navigating their way to the Kotel where they've never been. So in the midst of all that chaos, okay, what happens? They see the most incredible vision. They see suddenly before them an elderly Jewish man, a rabbinic-looking figure in a long black coat with a white beard, literally skipping through the streets, reciting the Psalms of the Tehillim of Hallel. And one of these Chayalim turns to the others and says, Miza, who is this? And another one, the Chayalim, turns to him and answers him, Zo Mashiach. It has to be that Mashiach has come. In the midst of that miraculous moment of hearing that announcement, Harabai B'Yadenu, Harabai B'Yadenu, these Chayalim that would call themselves secular, who wouldn't necessarily identify as being religious, were so transformed by that miraculous event that they were witnessing with their own very eyes, that they were certain that Mashiach had arrived. Now, obviously, 58 years later, we're still waiting for Mashiach Tzidkenu. So I'll let you know the punchline of who that individual was. It was none other than the great tzaddik Rabbi Aryeh Levine, the tzaddik of Yerushalayim. And Rabbi Aryeh, as soon as he heard the Kol Korah, the announcement of Harabai B'Yadenu, the Temple Mount is in our hands, he didn't wait for the all clear. He immediately ran to the old city. And there's a famous picture of the first mincha at the Kotel Maravi after all these years. Now, who were some of the luminaries at the first mincha? Rabbi Aryeh. Okay, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who was the chief rabbi of Tzahal at the time, of the armed forces at the time. He would later become the chief rabbi of Israel. Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kohen Cook, the son of Rav Avram Yitzchak Kohen Cook, and the Nazir, Rav David Cohen, the Talmid Mufak of Rav Cook. Basically the way the story goes is that Rav Goren obviously came there immediately. He was a general in the army. And there was one of the plugot, one of the brigades that captured the old city, were many of the Chayalim were actually graduates or students of Yeshivat Merkaz Harav. So they sent a jeep to pick up Tzvi Yehuda and also to pick up the Nazir, and they brought those two Rabbanim directly to the Kotel. But Rabbi Aryeh basically came there straight after encountering these Chayalim, and there's a picture of that first mincha, and you see these four great rabbinic luminaries surrounded by soldiers, and half the soldiers are the soldiers from the Pluga from Merkaz Harav that came with Tzvi Yehuda and the Nazir, and the other half are this group of Chiloni, secular soldiers that followed Rabbi Aryeh all the way to the Kotel. So it's a beautiful story, but what do you do with this story? Okay, 58 years later, okay, what do we do with this story? Those Chayalim were so transformed by the experience of the miracle they had witnessed with their own eyes. What do we do with that story 58 years later? Okay, So there's a pasuk we say every single day as part of davening, part of shacharis. We recite the psukim of Shirat Hayam, of the song at the sea. Every single day we recall the miracle, the miraculous event of the splitting of the sea. And that was such an important event, and that event left such a roshem, such an imprint on Jewish consciousness for all eternity, that we continue to recall it each and every single day. Okay. Whose phone is that? Chaim, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam kol nidron. Okay. So one of the psukim, one of the verses that we recite as we recall Kriyat Yamsuf every single day is this verse. Uvenei Yisrael halchu b'yabasha b'toch hayam. And the Jewish people walked on dry land within the sea. Now most of us read this verse and say, what? It must mean that a miracle happened and the sea split and the Jewish people walked through the sea and it wasn't muddy and they didn't sink and they didn't get stuck. They were able to, it was completely dry land as they walked through the sea. But we're going to learn a slightly different take on this pasuk that the Netivot Shalom, the Slonim Rabbi, introduces in the name of an earlier Hasidic master, the Noam Elimelech. And the Noam Elimelech in the Likutei Shoshan, in the back of the Noam Elimelech, says the following. This is text number 4 on our sheets. Says the following about our verse. He says, "Sheyesh tzadikim asher roim et gadlut habore v'romimut elukuto tamid al kol tzad v'sha'al." There are unique individuals, righteous individuals, who see the greatness of God and the splendor of His godliness always in everything that exists. From the heavens and beyond the heavens to here down on earth and everything upon it. Mikol abriyahem roim et borei kol amim. Hamechadesh v'tuva b'chol yom tamid maaseh bereshit. In everything that exists in the world, there are those unique individuals who have the capacity, what? To intuit the presence of God in everything in existence. Okay? God who is the one who continues to renew creation every single day. V'hemat tzadikim ro'in tamid kemo shera'u Yisrael beit giloi hanes shel Kriyat Yamsuf. They are the unique ones, the unique and righteous ones, who have the capacity to see always in the same way that the Jewish people experienced revelation at the miracle of Kriyat Yamsuf. There's the Medrash tells us that at Kriyat Yamsuf, a simple shifcha, a simple servant saw God and experienced revelation in a way that none of our prophets have ever experienced. Okay, so listen to how the Slonim Rabbi explains this. This idea is learned from our verse, and the Jewish people walked on dry land within the sea. Shakadosh Baruch Hu hishpia lehem az emuna kol kach chazaka ad shebiyabasha halchu kamo b'toch hayam. He says, what happened? The Jewish people were so transformed by that miracle of the sea splitting that even once they had already crossed the sea and were no longer b'toch hayam, no longer within the sea, they were on yabasha, they were on dry land looking back at the sea that had split before them. It was as if spiritually, emotionally, they were still within the sea. The miracle stayed with them. Even though they had already traversed the sea, and even though the miracle seemingly was behind them, they were so impacted by the miracle, and they were once again on Yabashah. It was ki'ilu, it was as if what? They were still b'toch hayam. That's how the Noam Elimelech learns this pasuk. He says they were so transformed in the miracle. Now look, listen what he says. He says, "Kamo shero b'toch hayam b'zman hanesh shel Kriyat Yamsuf." He says, even though they had already crossed the sea, it was as if they were still experiencing revelation the same way as when they were in the midst of the miracle. Kimi Kriyat Yamsuf nishar giloi gam liyabasha shegam b'yabasha ra'u et borei kol amim. That they were so impacted by the splitting of the sea that miracle stayed with them, and they continued to experience and feel God's presence, and as if their revelation was still ongoing, even though they had already left the miracle behind them. And this is the significance this miraculous event of Kriyat Yamsuf. Shagam b'yabasha ra'u elokut v'nikva b'hem ha'amunah b'yabasha kamo b'toch hayam. He says, this is why Kriyat Yamsuf is such a significant miracle, because it had such a transformative impact and affect on every single member of Klal Yisrael. Even though the miracle was behind them, that miracle stayed with them and stayed with us for all eternity. We recall this miracle every single day. So I was not zocha to be alive, to be living during the time of the 6-Day War. I had not yet been born. But I can tell you that there's no more emotional day as a proud Jew than Yom Yerushalayim. Even though I didn't live through the miracles myself, these miracles, the miraculous events of the 6-Day War, have had such a lasting impact with the Jewish people, have stayed with the Jewish people, okay, similar to this idea of Kriyas Yamsuf, which has stayed with the Jewish people and continues to inform and impact the way we see the world at large, okay? So, having said that, I want to now delve into the question of, it's a very nice idea, but is there a halachic precedent? We're going to just touch on this. We're not going to go into a lot of halacha. We're just going to touch on this question of, is there a precedent for establishing new celebrations amongst the Jewish people that have not been stipulated by the Torah itself? So Rabbi Shlomo Aviner is one of the great leaders in the religious Zionist world today. He's the Rosh Yeshiva of Ateret Kohanim in the Old City. He's also the Rav Rashi Emeritus of the Yeshuv of Beit El. And Rav Aviner deals with this question of establishing a new holiday. This is text number 5 on our sheets. Kfiyat Moed Chadash she'enu katuv b'Torah. That's what the koter. That's the heading. The establishment of new celebrations that were not explicitly stated in the Torah. And he says, Ha'im Yom Yerushalayim hu Yom Tov. Is Yom Yerushalayim to be considered a Yom Tov? Can we call Yom Yerushalayim a Yom Tov? Ma tikfa. What is its status? Ha'im mutar o af chuva likva Yom Tov chadash. Is it permissible or even obligatory for us to what? To establish a new day of celebration. So listen how Rav Aviner answers this question. He says there's a verse in Parsha Ba'alotcha that says, Uv'yom simchatchem, uv'moadechem, uv'roshei chadshechem, utkatem b'chatzotzot. Okay? And the pasuk is that on the days of your joy, Yom Simchatchem, and on the holidays, and on Rosh Chodesh, you shall sound the chatzotzot, the silver trumpets in celebration. So that verse at face value seems redundant because we say Uva Moadechem. Moadechem means what? The pilgrimage festivals. And we say Rosh Chodeshechem, meaning Rosh Chodesh. But what about Uviyom Simchatchem, the days of your joy? Seemingly, the only days in the Torah that we have where there's a mandate to be b'simcha are what? The Shalosh Regalim, which are the Moadim. So why does the pasuk say Uviyom Simchatchem u'b'moadechem? So listen to how the Ibn Ezra explains our pasuk. Mefarash Rabbeinu Avram Ibn Ezra, the Ibn Ezra explains our verse as follows. Sheshavtem me'eretz oyev, when you've returned from the lands of your enemy, or nitzachtem oyev haba alechem, or you've been victorious after being attacked by an enemy, ukfatem yom simcha kimei purim. What is the pasuk teaching us? Says the Ibn Ezra, you shall establish days of celebration and thanks, just like in the days of Purim. That's the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra learns our pasuk in Parshas Ba'aloscha to say what? That there's a precedent. The Torah is giving us the recipe. Uv'yom simchatchem, you shall rejoice in those moments when we have either returned to the land, okay, or overcome enemies who have attacked us. Now, if we know anything about the history of the 6-Day War, okay, if you read any of the memoirs of the political leaders during the 6-Day War, the prime minister had already given the order, okay, Levi Eshkol, to the Chevra Kedisha all the Chevra Kedisha all over the country to prepare public parks to become cemeteries. Okay, they were so terrified that there were going to be tens of thousands of Niftarim from the Arab onslaught that they were anticipating. They were terrified that we were going to lose tens of thousands of people in this war. And they were making the preparations to have, don't forget, from 1948 until after the Six-Day War, Har HaZeitim had fallen in Jordanian hands. For 19 years, no one was buried in Har HaZeitim. Okay, they had just established after that in I think 1950 or 1951 the cemetery in Sanhedria was established, and then later Har HaMenuchot. But they had no place. They were anticipating tens of thousands of losses of people dying, and they were literally telling the Chevra Kadisha all over the country, prepare parks, so we'll have places to bury the Niftarim. So in just a short moment of time, come out overnight. We went from fearing utter destruction to seeing great salvation. Mikan shemoadim einam dafka ela shenikvu b'TORAH. From this pasuk, we learn that celebrations are not only those holidays that are implicitly stated by the Torah. Ela efshar likvo moadim chadashim al nitzchonot v'yeshuot. But rather, that's permissible, at least according to the way the Ibn Ezra learns this pasuk, to establish additional holidays to celebrate and show our appreciation for victories and salvations. So Yom Yerushalayim is a day where we not only celebrate, but we acknowledge the nace of Ichud Yerushalayim, of the unification of Yerushalayim. I want to share with you something that is really extremely powerful. The next source we're going to learn together. There's kind of a bootleg. There was a bootleg recording of the words of the Nitivot Shalom, the Slonim Rebbe, who we just learned from a few moments ago. Before he was the Slonim Rebbe, he became the Rebbe in 1981 when his father-in-law, the Birkat Avraham, the previous Rebbe of Slonim, passed away. But in June of 1967, the Nitivot Shalom, Rabbi Shalom Narach Bazowski, was still serving not as the Rebbe, but as the Rosh Yeshiva in the Slonim Yeshiva in Mea Shearim. And this morning we all experienced going to a safe room when there was an azakah. So there was a sikha that the Rebbe gave during those days in June of the Six-Day War, where the yeshiva had moved from the Beis Medrash down to the Miklat. They moved the Beit Midrash temporarily into the Miklat till there was an all clear and quiet. And this is a sikha that the Nesiva Shalom delivered in June of 1967 after they heard Matagor's Kol Koreh, Harabai B'Yadenu, Harabai B'Yadenu, while they were still sitting in the Miklat, in the bomb shelter of the yeshiva of Slonim in Mea Shearim. And these are just a few lines of a bootleg transcript that was recorded of the Slonim Rebbe talking about the significance of the moment of hearing that announcement, Harabai B'Yadenu, Harabai B'Yadenu. Listen to his words. Anu mechuyavim lahakir b'nisim shasalanu hakadosh baruch hu b'yamim ha'elu. We are required to recognize and show our thanks for the miracles that God has done for us in these days. Okay, nisim v'uyim v'ara panim milfanav yiparach shemo la'amo Yisrael mashalo zachu lirot harbe asarot dorot. Okay, revealed miracles and the revelation of Hashem's presence before us before His people Israel, in a way that has not been seen for tens of generations. And it's prohibited for us to what? To ignore and not acknowledge the goodness that God has bestowed upon us. Shagam even those who are distant from Amunah, meaning that are not dati. Okay? And anyone who, this is the most powerful line, anyone has a brain literally in their skull. Modim shelo hayashum inyan TV b'anitzachon shasa kadosh baruch hu ba'ofen mufla b'yoter. He says that we'll acknowledge what? There's no natural way to explain how we were victorious in such an incredible, wondrous way. Shum tzava Allah hasig hisigim ke'elu shekochot kabirim hitmotetu lefanav b'shaot siparot. No other nation has experienced such a miracle where literally incredible power and forces have crumbled before them in a matter of hours, says the Slonim Rebbe. Ashrenu matov chalkenu. How great is and how appreciative we are for that which we've been given. B'sha'ah gdola azot, at this wondrous moment. Shashuv ha'ir lanu HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'arat panim v'giluim shelo zacha shum dor v'huchser lanu makam mikdashenu. That we've experienced God's revelation in a way that no other generation has experienced, and He's returned to us what? The place of our temple. Rabbi B'Yadenu. Makam Shelo Zaza Shchina Misham, the place that Hashem's presence has never ceased to rest. Ha'osher v'atanu kachi gadol sheyudi margish v'olamo, the greatest pleasure that a Jew can feel in this world, hu b'sha'ah shemargish b'kirvat elukuto yibarach, is in those moments when he feels close to Hashem, when he feels he's in the presence of God. Uchamod Amrin, as the pasuk says, "Vani kirvat elokim litav." When I feel close to God, it is good for me. V'amakom ha'mesugal b'yoter lezeh hu bakotel hamaravi, says the son of Rabbi. And a place where a Jew can feel this in the most palpable way is at the Kotel Maravi. So that's the first idea he introduces. Now he introduces a second idea. Hanes Hasheni, the second miracle. The first miracle, by the way, in the longer Sikha is talking about first the establishment of the state of Israel and the Jewish people returning to Israel after the Shoah. And now he's going to talk about the second miracle. It's the revelation of God's love for the Jewish people, even though we're really not deserving of it or worthy of it. That He's returned to our hands the remnant of the Beit Hamikdash, the Kotel Maravi, Sha'amru Chazal, as the sages teach us, Ki me'olam lo zaza shchina misham, shenamar hine omed achar kotleinu, that Hashem's presence never ceased to exist there, as the pasuk says, that Hashem, so to speak, is standing on the other side of our wall. Achar Yud-Tet Shana, after 19 years, Shekvar hitrachaknu mimakom hakadosh hazeh, that we were distanced from this holy sacred place. V'chsur alanu mikamot hakadoshim, marata machpelah, yesheni chevron v'kever Rachel. And what else has been returned to us? Marata machpelah, kever Rachel, and all of ancient Chevron has been returned to us. Places where no Jew has been allowed to step foot for the last 19 years. And what a painful experience it is to not be allowed to visit the graves of our ancestors, our mothers and our fathers. And now they're once again within our hands. Anu omdim nidamim umzuazim me'agilim agdolim shara lanu Hashem yibrach. We stand stunned and in awe, in total shock, from the wonders that Hashem has revealed to us at this moment. Uma ashiv Hashem, and then he quotes the line from Hallel: "How can we give thanks to you, Hashem?" All right, so 58 years later, again. How do we understand and contextualize it? The Rabbi, in the midst of the miracle, gives us such powerful, beautiful language that it's the revelation. It's a miracle we haven't seen for tens of generations. But 58 years later, how do we contextualize the events of the 6 Day War and the significance of the return to Zion? So we're going to learn a short piece now from Rav Kook. Rav Kook says the following idea: Ha'gu'ulanim shechet hivo lechet. Redemption is a continuous process and it's ongoing. Listen to Rav Kook's words. Gulat Mitzrayim Gulata Tira Shlema Hi Pula Achat She'ena Poseket. The redemption from Egypt and the future final redemption, meaning what? Mashiach, is one act, one continuum that hasn't been interrupted. It's the act of Hashem's strong hand and outstretched arm. Asher hechla b'Mitzrayim, that was first extended where? In Mitzrayim. V'po'elet ha'pulotah b'chol ha'mesibot. And it continues to weave its ways through all eventualities. Says Rav Kook in the most beautiful poetic language. Rav Kook says that the redemption from Egypt was the beginning of a process that continues to unfold. And all of the hills and valleys, all those peaks and valleys, all those great moments and then difficult moments are all part of the process. We have to be able, like Rabbi Akiva, to what? To see the big picture. And when we experience miraculous events, we have to celebrate them. And then when we experience what seem like setbacks, we have to take a step back and say, what? How does this fit within the big picture, the unfolding drama, the continuing drama of Jewish destiny? My great teacher, Rabbi David Aaron, talks about when you go into an art gallery, okay? You go into an art gallery, you see these great tapestries on the wall. They're masterpieces, right? But if you were to go and put your face literally up against those tapestries, what would you see? You'd see a bunch of ugly, random blotches, squiggly, confusing lines. And instead of seeing a masterpiece, you see something that looks ugly, confusing, and maybe challenging to understand. It's only when we take a step back and begin to take in the whole picture that those ugly blotches and the squiggly lines and that which was confusing to us begins not only to make sense, but to come together as a masterpiece. And says Rabbi Aaron, and I think it's such a powerful idea, and that's really what Rabbi Akiva has the capacity to do. We began with Rabbi Akiva. That's what we learned from Rabbi Akiva, the ability to what? To take a step back from where we are and appreciate these events within the context of the continuing unfolding drama, as Rav Kook suggests, of the process of Jewish redemption. If we look at the whole tapestry, we'll not only see the challenging moments of the here and now, the ugly blotches and confusing random lines of the here and now, but we'll begin to see how far we've come and be able to have the capacity to celebrate our accomplishments even as we continue to struggle. Okay, so I want to bring this all together. Rabbi Aviner, who we heard from earlier, we're going to close with Rabbi Aviner's words and then maybe one more story. Rabbi Aviner says, Yom Yerushalayim einenu rak od yom l'tzayin mo'orea menutak u'muvudad shalatzal mimita l'chaim. Yom Yerushalayim is not just a lone, isolated event to celebrate salvation from death to life. Elu yom mitzayin me'ura kabir. It's a day to recall a great event. It's the coming together of the journey and the process of tens of hundreds of years of the redemption of the Jewish people in our days. It's a process that continues. The Yamshich Be'ezrat Hashem, and will continue with God's help. Keshem Sha'ar Hayom Navninu Be'eretz Yisrael, just as we've been able to build up to this point here in Eretz Yisrael, Kach Nosif Ligael, will continue to merit to build and to be redeemed. Migula Gashmit Navo L'Tachlit, and from the physical redemption that we're experiencing, we will come to our ultimate purpose, L'Gula Ruchanit, the spiritual redemption of Mashiach Tzidkenu. I want to close with one last story, with a story. A number of years ago, in the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv, there was a beautiful, poignant memoir that was published. It was titled Eifo HaKotel Shali, Where is My Kotel? And it was a personal memoir of an elderly gentleman who had grown up in the old city of Yerushalayim in the 1920s and 30s. And he described that when they would go to visit the Kotel in those days, okay, they literally had to navigate the same kind of maze that we have, except the Kotel wasn't in front of this cleared out gigantic plaza. When you got to the Kotel, it was a very narrow passageway that you had to navigate to be able to go visit the Kotel. And this gentleman wrote in his article, it's a very personal, poignant memoir. He says, when you finally got to the Kotel in those days, you felt a real palpable sense of Zecher L'Chorban, of appreciating the destruction of Yerushalayim, of appreciating the loss, the things that we don't have. So a few days later, there was someone who wrote a letter to the editor and thanking the editor for publishing this memoir, but basically taking issue with the conclusion. And that is, he said, in such a beautiful way, I'll never forget this, he said, it's true I'm sure it's true that in the days that you grew up in the old city, when you finally got to the Kotel, you indeed had a very palpable sense of Zecher l'Chorban, of remembering the destruction of Yerushalayim. He says, but the Kotel we have today, which has this plaza cleared out in front of it, which is lit up 24/7, and people of all faiths come from all over the world to pour out their heart and soul. He says, this is a Zecher l'Mikdash. This is a reminder of what the Beis HaMikdash was like. Ki beiti tefillah yikareh l'chol amim. That my house will be a house of prayer for all nations. He says, this is a Zecher l'Mikdash. And my friends, as we get ready for the awesome Yom Tov, I'm going to call it a Yom Tov. We just learned today we can call it a Yom Tov. As we get ready for the awesome Yom Tov, the Yom Yerushalayim, it's that constant tension that we're living through. On one hand, there's a palpable sense of Zecher l'Chorban. On the other hand, we have to appreciate how far we've come, as Rav Kook teaches us, to see the big picture, as Rabbi Akiva teaches us, and recognize when we come to the Kotel today, we feel that sense of Zecher l'Mikdash. Here at Summit, we be blessed not only to experience Zecher l'Mikdash, but to experience Binyan HaMikdash, Binyan Beis HaMikdash, as we celebrate Yom Yerushalayim in the days ahead.